The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the De Luca family estate in Naples, casting delicate shadows across Camilla's face as she stood before the mirror. Her wedding dress hung beside her, a masterpiece of ivory silk and hand-stitched lace that had taken 4 months to perfect. Every bead, every stitch, every carefully placed pearl represented a dream she'd cultivated since she was 7 years old. Watching her mother waltz through the family home in her own wedding gown, Camilla De Luca was the golden girl of Naples. Born into one of the oldest Italian families with ties that ran deep through the city's upper echelons, she'd grown up surrounded by elegance, tradition, and unspoken rules. Her father, Giuseppe De Luca, was a man of significant influence, the kind of influence that didn't need to be explained or loudly announced. It simply existed, like the foundation of the marble palazzo that had been her family's home for 3 generations. But Camilla had never been interested in the darker aspects of that influence. She'd chosen a different path, or so she believed. She studied architecture at the University of Naples, dreamed of designing buildings that would reshape the city's skyline, imagined a life where her name meant something because of her own accomplishments, not because of her bloodline. Yet even as she pursued her own dreams, the weight of family expectation pressed gently but inevitably against her shoulders. Then Dante Romano entered her life. It happened at a charity gala 3 years ago. She was there because her mother insisted. He was there because his family's presence was required. A show of unity in the upper circles of Neapolitan society. Their eyes met across a crowded ballroom lit by crystal chandeliers. And in that moment, something shifted. At least, that's what Camilla told herself. At least that's what she wanted to believe. Dante Romano was everything a man from his world should be. Tall, impeccably dressed, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that could disarm anyone within a 10-foot radius. He was charming in the way that only men born into power could be charming. Effortless, natural, dangerous. Within 6 months, he was at her father's door with a formal request to court her. Within a year, he'd proposed with a diamond ring that cost more than most people's homes. Her mother wept with joy. Her father nodded with approval. Her cousins celebrated with champagne. The announcement sent ripples through Naples's social circles. 2 of the city's most prominent families were joining their legacies. It was a union that made sense on every level that mattered to the world around her. But on a personal level, Camilla had convinced herself it was love. Or at least she'd convinced herself that love in her world didn't look like the movies. Love in her world was about compatibility, shared values, building a future together. Dante was kind to her, attentive in public, and passionate in private. He listened to her architectural ideas with genuine interest. He took her to museums and galleries. He remembered details about her childhood that she'd mentioned only once. The wedding planning consumed the next 18 months. Camilla threw herself into it with the precision of an architect designing a cathedral. Every element had to be perfect, because perfection was the only acceptable standard in her family. The venue was the Benedictine monastery of San Gaudioso, a 13th-century structure that overlooked the Bay of Naples. The guest list included over 300 of the city's most influential families. The flowers, white roses, peonies, and cascading jasmine, were being flown in from a specific grower in Tuscany, because Camilla had decided that the scent of those particular blooms represented hope and new beginnings. She'd spent 3 months finding the perfect dress, consulting with designers, sketching her own modifications until it was uniquely hers. The wedding favors were handcrafted by artisans, small boxes of Neapolitan pastries wrapped in silk ribbons. The reception menu had been planned with a 3-star chef who'd personally selected wines from vineyards that had been in operation for over a century. Every detail was infused with intention. Every choice was deliberate. Every element was meant to tell a story of 2 families united, 2 people in love, a future gleaming with promise. The night before the wedding, the De Luca family estate transformed into something from a fairy tale. Guests had been arriving all day, relatives from Milan, Rome, and beyond. The sprawling gardens were decorated with thousands of white lights that twinkled like stars pulled down from the sky. A string quartet played beneath a tent draped in flowing ivory fabric. Champagne flowed in endless streams. The air smelled of flowers, perfume, and anticipation. Camilla moved through the celebration in a kind of blissful haze. She wore a silk rehearsal dress, simpler than the wedding gown but no less elegant. Women embraced her, offering congratulations and whispered advice about marriage. Men shook her hand and offered toasts. Her father danced with her, his eyes shining with pride. Her mother adjusted her hair and straightened her dress, fussing over her with the tenderness of a woman watching her only daughter step into womanhood. By midnight, she was exhausted in the way that only anticipation could make someone exhausted. She'd excused herself from the party, needing a moment of solitude before tomorrow's chaos. The private terrace on the eastern wing of the estate was her refuge, a hidden garden where she'd spent countless hours as a teenager, reading books and dreaming of futures that felt possible and distant all at once. The night air was cool against her skin. The stars above were impossibly bright, unobstructed by city lights in this particular corner of the property. She could hear the muted sounds of the celebration behind her, but here in this space there was only the gentle rustle of wind through the lemon trees her grandmother had planted decades ago. She didn't hear him approach. That was the first thing that would haunt her later. The fact that she didn't hear Dante until it was too late to pretend she hadn't seen what she saw. Her fiancé was on the terrace with someone else. His hands were in her hair. Her cousin's, Isabella's, hands were gripping his jacket. Their bodies were pressed together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The moment froze. Camilla's mind struggled to process what her eyes were clearly registering. Her brain refused to accept the information being presented to it. Time seemed to collapse inward, and the world narrowed to just this image. Dante and Isabella, locked together on the terrace where she'd been moments before, breathing in the same night air, sharing the same stars. Her veil slipped from her hand. She didn't remember holding it and fell to the stone floor with barely a whisper of sound. That small noise was enough. Dante's eyes opened and his head turned. For a fraction of a second, she saw something flash across his face. Panic, certainly, but something else too. Something like resignation, as though he'd been caught doing something inevitable. Camilla didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't demand explanations or rage or fall to pieces. Instead, something inside her crystallized. It was as though the girl who'd spent 18 months planning a perfect wedding suddenly shattered, and something entirely different rose from the fragments. She turned and walked back into the mansion. She didn't look back. The wedding never happened. By dawn, every person at the DeLuca estate knew. The rumors spread through the family like wildfire. Whispered conversations in hallways, shocked silences when younger cousins entered rooms, the way her aunts looked at her with a mixture of pity and scandal that made her skin crawl. Dante had tried to follow her into the house, tried to explain, tried to convince her that what she'd witnessed was a mistake, a moment of weakness, something that meant nothing. Camilla locked herself in her childhood bedroom and didn't emerge for 2 days. Her mother came to her, armed with tissues and assurances that these things happened, that passion could override judgment, that perhaps with time and counseling, they could work through this. Her father came to her, silent and furious. His jaw clenched so tightly she worried he might break his own teeth. He asked her only one question. Did he hurt you? When she said no, he simply left. That somehow hurt worse than any words he could have spoken. On the third day, Camilla emerged from her room and began making phone calls. She reached out to her lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Lucrezia, who'd helped her with property contracts for some of her architectural projects. She consulted with an accountant about her personal finances, assets that were entirely separate from her family's holdings, thanks to her grandmother's foresight in setting up a trust fund decades ago. She made inquiries about apartments in the city, starting the process of separating her life from the DeLuca family machinery. Her father called her into his study on the 4th day. He sat behind his massive oak desk and she stood before it like a child being summoned for discipline. He studied her in silence for several long moments before speaking. He told her that Dante Romano had requested an audience with him that morning, had tried to convince Giuseppe that the wedding should simply be postponed, that Camilla would forgive him eventually, that these things were common among men in their world, and that she was being unreasonable. Her father had thrown him out of the house. What surprised Camilla was that he seemed furious not because of the infidelity itself, but because Dante had the audacity to believe that a DeLuca daughter would simply accept such betrayal. "You are my daughter," her father said. "You carry the DeLuca name. This insult is not just to you, it is to this family. It is to my honor." Camilla listened to her father speak about honor and family legacy, about the affront of Dante's behavior, and she realized something crucial. She realized that her father wasn't angry because she was hurt. He was angry because her pain reflected poorly on him. The distinction was subtle but profound. She left his study and continued with her plans. Within 2 weeks, she'd moved into a small apartment in the Vomero district, a charming one-bedroom with exposed stone walls and a balcony overlooking the city. It was modest compared to the DeLuca estate, but it was entirely hers. She paid the deposit with her own money, signed the lease with her own name, and stood in the empty space feeling something she hadn't expected: freedom. Her mother called, begging her to reconsider. Her siblings reached out to express their support, their confusion, their worry about how this would affect the family's standing. Her aunts and uncles offered advice ranging from forgiving Dante to pursuing legal action against him for emotional damage. Everyone had opinions. Everyone wanted her to perform her pain in a particular way, according to the script that family politics demanded. But Camilla was done performing. She began spending her days walking through Naples, observing the city from a different perspective. She noticed the architecture that others overlooked, the way older buildings had been modernized without erasing their history, the beauty in decay, the stories written into crumbling facades and narrow alleyways. She started sketching again, not for clients or commissions, but for herself. Ideas began to flow from her hands: designs for community spaces in underserved neighborhoods, concepts for renovating abandoned buildings, plans for transforming forgotten corners of the city into something vibrant and alive. 3 weeks after the abandoned wedding, she received a visit from her cousin Isabella. Isabella arrived at her apartment in the evening, her face pale and drawn. She looked like a woman who hadn't been sleeping well. The conversation that followed was brief and excruciating. Isabella explained that Dante had been pursuing her for months, that she'd tried to resist, that the night of the party she'd been drinking, and he'd taken advantage of that vulnerability. She said she was telling Camilla because she needed her to understand that this wasn't some grand betrayal, born of love or desire. It was opportunism and manipulation on Dante's part. Camilla listened to her cousin's confession and realized that the betrayal had never truly been about Isabella. Her cousin was simply another piece in whatever game Dante had been playing. That realization was somehow more damaging than if it had been a passionate affair. "What are you going to do?" Isabella asked, tears streaming down her face. Camilla looked at this woman she'd grown up with, this person who shared her blood and now shared the burden of having been used by the same man. And she said something that surprised them both: "I'm going to live." She didn't mean it as forgiveness. She didn't mean it as acceptance. She meant it as a promise to herself that Dante Romano would not be the center of her narrative anymore. She'd spent so long building her life around him, around the image of him, around the future she'd imagined with him. Now it was time to build something else. In the following months, Camilla transformed. It wasn't a dramatic metamorphosis or a sudden revelation. It was gradual, like watching the seasons change. She stopped wearing the expensive jewelry her mother kept trying to gift her. She began dressing differently, still elegant, but in a way that felt authentic rather than performative. She cut her hair shorter, a decision that scandalized her mother and delighted her younger sister. More importantly, she started making connections in the city that had nothing to do with her family name. She volunteered with organizations that helped renovate homes in struggling neighborhoods. She met architects and designers and urban planners who were trying to reshape Naples into something more equitable and beautiful. She attended exhibitions and lectures and community meetings. She built a life that was entirely separate from the DeLuca family machinery. By month 6, she'd landed her first independent project, designing the renovation of a community center in the Sanità neighborhood, one of Naples's oldest and most challenging districts. The pay wasn't exceptional, but the work was meaningful. The project represented something bigger than just buildings. It represented hope for revitalization, for communities that had been neglected by the wealthy and powerful. During this time, she heard rumors about Dante. She heard that his family was disappointed in him, that his father was considering removing him from the family business, that he was trying to rebuild his reputation by making charitable donations and announcing an engagement to a woman from a prominent Sicilian family. She heard that he was drinking more than was probably healthy, that his relationships were becoming increasingly unstable, that he was desperately trying to salvage his image through displays of wealth and power. She heard all of this and felt nothing. Not forgiveness, not satisfaction, not even vindication. She felt nothing because he'd become irrelevant to her life. That was the most powerful realization of all, that the man she'd planned to spend her life with had become a stranger, whose name she rarely thought about anymore. But everything was about to change. The project in Sanita succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Within a year, the community center had become a hub of activity. Neighborhood children came for after-school programs, teenagers participated in vocational training, adults attended literacy classes, and job workshops. The building itself, transformed under Camilla's architectural direction, had become a symbol of hope and renewal. Local news outlets ran stories about the young woman who'd designed the space. Urban planning magazines featured her work. Older architects began reaching out to her for collaboration on other projects. But Camilla noticed something else happening. Something that started as a whisper and gradually became impossible to ignore. She began receiving job offers from people connected to organized crime. At first, she rejected them outright. Her family's connections to that world were distant enough that she'd been able to maintain plausible deniability about the exact nature of their power. But as the offers became more frequent and more specific, she realized that her reputation had expanded beyond the architectural community. People who operated in Naples' shadow economy had heard about a young woman who could transform spaces, who understood urban design, who could move through the city's different worlds with grace and intelligence. A man named Vittorio approached her at a gallery opening. He was in his 60s, impeccably dressed with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that suggested someone entirely comfortable with his position in the world. He didn't try to seduce her with offers of money or power. Instead, he simply asked if she'd be interested in a consultation regarding some property holdings he had in the city. Camilla's initial instinct was to refuse, but something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the realization that she was naive if she thought she could build a career in Naples without eventually intersecting with the networks of power that actually shaped the city. Perhaps it was something darker, a part of her that had been awakened by the discovery of Dante's infidelity and wanted to understand how power really worked in her city. She agreed to meet with Vittorio. Over coffee in a small cafe in the Chiaia district, Vittorio explained his proposition. He had several properties, warehouses, apartments, retail spaces, scattered throughout Naples. Many of them were in disrepair or underutilized. He wanted to renovate them, to transform them into something productive and profitable. He wanted to hire her as his architect and project manager, with complete creative control and a salary that was nearly double what she'd been earning with legitimate architectural firms. What exactly would these properties be used for? Camilla asked, even though she already suspected the answer. Vittorio smiled. Does it matter? They'll be legal. There will be no criminal activity conducted in or around these spaces. I'm simply a businessman trying to develop real estate. The fact that I've accumulated my wealth through various means shouldn't concern you. Camilla should have refused. Every rational part of her mind was screaming at her to walk away. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant since the wedding that never happened, was waking up. This was power. This was the ability to shape the physical world according to her vision. This was an opportunity to do work that was meaningful on a scale she'd never imagined. She accepted the offer. Over the next 2 years, Camilla transformed Vittorio's properties into something remarkable. She created a portfolio of unique spaces, converted warehouses that became art galleries and music venues, apartment buildings that became models of sustainable design, retail spaces that attracted independent businesses and entrepreneurs. The work was exceptional, and more importantly, it was entirely legal. She was committing no crimes. She was simply using her talents to help a man who may have obtained his wealth through questionable means, transform that wealth into something tangible and real. But something else was happening in parallel with her professional success. Camilla was becoming a presence in Naples' shadow circles. Business owners, artists, community leaders, people who operated both inside and outside the law, began seeking her out. They wanted her vision for their spaces, her ideas about urban renewal, her understanding of how architecture could serve both beauty and function. More significantly, she began to understand something fundamental about power in Naples. It wasn't just about money or violence or family connections, though those things certainly mattered. Power in Naples was about relationships, about being someone that other people needed, about having skills and vision that couldn't be easily replicated. Power was about becoming indispensable. Camilla became indispensable. She caught the attention of important people. She was invited to dinners and meetings where she was the only woman, where decisions about the city's future were made in low voices over expensive wine. She listened more than she spoke, But when she offered observations about urban development or possibilities for property renovation, people paid attention. She was young and beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was smart and capable and entirely unconcerned with the theatrics of power that seemed to dominate everyone else's behavior. During this period, she rarely thought about Dante Romano. Occasionally, his name would surface in conversations. He'd been implicated in some scandal. His family had lost influence. There were rumors that his father had found him work outside Naples to remove him from the city's social circles. She heard that he'd married the Sicilian woman he'd been engaged to and that they'd relocated to Rome. She heard that he'd become increasingly erratic and that his marriage was struggling. When his name came up, Camilla felt a distant pity, the way one might feel pity for a character in a tragic play. But the wound, if it could still be called that, had calcified into something that no longer hurt. It had become simply scar tissue, evidence that something had happened but no longer an active wound. 4 years after the abandoned wedding, something shifted dramatically in Naples's power structure. An aging crime boss died unexpectedly, and his organization fragmented into competing factions. In the chaos that followed, there was an opportunity, a window in which power could be seized by someone smart enough to understand the landscape and strong enough to move in that landscape without hesitation. Vittorio came to Camilla with a proposition that surprised her, despite everything. "I'm going to move into a bigger role," he said. "I'm going to consolidate power in this city, and I want you at my side. Not as an architect, but as a partner. You understand how the city works. You understand how to build things. You understand strategy. I need someone I can trust absolutely, and I trust you." Camilla should have been terrified, should have refused, should have recognized this as the moment when she crossed a line from which there would be no return. Instead, she found herself asking clarifying questions about what his vision was, how he planned to operate, what role she would actually play in this expansion of power. Over the following weeks, they met repeatedly. Vittorio laid out a plan that was sophisticated and, in its own way, visionary. He wanted to position himself not as a brutal crime boss but as a stabilizing force, someone who could manage Naples's underworld in a way that benefited all parties, minimized violence, and created a kind of order that allowed legitimate businesses to flourish alongside illegal operations. It was naive thinking in many ways, but it was also seductive. The idea of being part of something bigger, of having the power to shape the city's future, of being essential to an operation that affected thousands of people, it appealed to Camilla in ways she couldn't fully articulate to herself. She agreed to become Vittorio's partner. The public face of this was simple. Vittorio established a legitimate real estate development company, and Camilla became its CEO and chief architect. They began acquiring properties throughout Naples and launching ambitious renovation projects that genuinely improved neighborhoods and created jobs. On the surface, they were simply visionary developers trying to bring new life to the city. But beneath that surface, they were consolidating power. Vittorio used his wealth and connections to influence local politicians, to ensure favorable zoning decisions, to protect certain territories and populations, while strategically eliminating competition. Camilla, for her part, provided the architectural vision that made it all seem legitimate and valuable. She moved into a penthouse apartment that overlooked the Bay of Naples. She hired a team of architects and engineers. She began getting written up in business magazines and invited to speak at urban planning conferences. By day, she was Camilla Romano, successful businesswoman, visionary architect, driver of Naples's urban renewal. By night, she was something else entirely. Years passed. Camilla's company became one of the most prominent real estate development firms in southern Italy. She transformed neighborhoods, created jobs, and built a reputation as someone who genuinely cared about improving the city, while also being brilliant at making deals that benefited her investors enormously. Architectural magazines published features about her work. Universities invited her to lecture. Young women in Naples saw her as proof that you could be powerful without compromising your integrity. None of them knew that she'd long ago compromised something far more fundamental than integrity. Vittorio died when Camilla was 34 years old. It was a heart attack, sudden and seemingly unpredictable, though Camilla suspected there were people who understood the medical reality better than the doctors had expressed. His death created a vacuum, and almost immediately, various factions began positioning themselves to fill it, but they didn't account for Camilla. She'd spent 8 years learning how to operate in this world. how to build relationships with the right people, how to understand the intricate networks of loyalty and obligation that actually ran Naples. She'd been present at crucial meetings. She'd listened carefully to every conversation. She'd paid attention to who owed favors to whom, who was trustworthy, who was dangerous, who was vulnerable to manipulation or alliance. Within 6 months of Vittorio's death, she'd consolidated his operations under her control. Not by being brutal or violent. That wasn't her style, and more importantly, it wouldn't have worked. Instead, she systematically made herself indispensable to the various parties that Vittorio had dealt with. She mediated disputes, honored agreements, and created new opportunities that benefited everyone. She became the person who understood how to keep the machinery running smoothly. The rumors about her began to circulate through Naples's underworld like electricity through water. There was a woman who'd taken over Vittorio's empire, a woman who was ruthless in her intelligence but never unnecessarily cruel, a woman who understood that stability was more profitable than chaos, a woman who'd maneuvered her way into absolute power without anyone realizing the game was being played until it was already over. Some people called her luck. Some called it genius. Some called it destiny. Camilla didn't call it anything, she simply worked. Her legitimate business continued to flourish. Her buildings continued to transform the city. To the outside world, she was still simply an exceptionally talented architect and businesswoman. But to the people who operated in Naples's shadow, she was something far more significant. She was the person with her finger on the pulse of the city. She was the one who decided which businesses prospered and which ones failed. She was the one who maintained the balance between legitimate commerce and the operations that funded themselves through less legal means. It was during a business dinner at one of her renovated restaurants, a beautiful space housed in a 14th century palace, that Dante Romano walked in. He was with his wife, a blonde woman who looked perpetually worried. He was heavier than Camilla remembered, his face marked by years of indulgence and stress. He carried himself with the diminished confidence of a man whose family's power had eroded significantly, and who no longer believed he could restore it. He didn't see Camilla until she was standing directly in front of his table. For a moment his face went pale. He looked like a man seeing a ghost. Not the ghost of someone dead, but the ghost of a future that never materialized, of the woman he'd betrayed and who'd subsequently disappeared from his world entirely, replaced by rumors and legend. Camilla smiled. It was a cool smile, perfectly professional, the kind of smile you give to an acquaintance you haven't seen in many years. She extended her hand as though greeting a stranger. Dante, it's been so long. I heard you've been working with your family's interests in Rome. You should have stayed there. The statement seemed to physically diminish him. His wife looked confused, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite understand. Dante's hands trembled slightly as he shook Camilla's hand, and she felt the familiar texture of the diamond ring she'd once worn. Not on his finger, of course, but represented in the expensive jewels on his wife's hand. Everything about him was an attempt to recreate what he'd once had, to pretend that the intervening years hadn't stripped him of something fundamental. Camilla excused herself and returned to her table, where she was dining with two of Naples's most influential business leaders. She resumed her conversation as though the interruption had never occurred, but she couldn't help noticing that Dante and his wife's meal was cut short. They left within 20 minutes. Later that night, back in her penthouse, Camilla stood on her balcony overlooking the city. The lights of Naples spread out beneath her. Millions of lives, billions of decisions, countless intersections of chance and choice that created the reality everyone inhabited. Somewhere in this city was a girl who'd once believed in fairy tales and perfect weddings. Somewhere in this city was a cathedral where she'd never worn that dress, never made those vows, never promised to love and honor a man who saw her as just another piece in his game of power. That girl felt impossibly distant. Camilla barely recognized her anymore. The woman looking out at Naples now was someone different entirely. She was someone who'd taken her pain and transformed it into something harder, colder, more valuable. She'd taken her betrayal and used it as a blueprint for understanding power. She'd taken her dream, the perfect wedding, the perfect marriage, the perfect life, and destroyed it so thoroughly that she'd been able to build something far more real from the ashes. She'd taken the name that was never given to her, Romano, and made it mean something. She'd built an empire that made Dante's family's weakened influence look like child's play. She'd become the kind of woman that men like Dante Romano would fear if they were smart enough to understand what they should be afraid of. But here was the truth that Camilla had learned, the secret that kept her awake on certain nights. Power was empty. It filled you completely while simultaneously leaving you hollow. You could transform a city, but you couldn't transform yourself. You could control outcomes and manage people and shape the future, but you couldn't escape the past. It stayed with you like a shadow, like evidence of the girl you'd once been. A constant reminder that you'd chosen this path not because you wanted it, but because you'd been broken and didn't know any other way to put yourself back together. The wedding she'd planned with such meticulous care would have lasted approximately 6 hours. It would have been followed by a honeymoon, a marriage, perhaps children. A life that looked impressive from the outside, but that she now understood would have been predicated on a fundamental lie. That wedding would have bound her to a man who saw her as a possession, as a game piece, as a tool to be manipulated for his own purposes. Instead, she'd built an empire. She'd become indispensable to the functioning of an entire city. She'd earned respect through intelligence and capability rather than family name. She'd become so powerful that a man who'd once made her heart race now trembled in her presence. But as she stood on that balcony, looking out at the city she controlled, Camilla found herself asking a question she hadn't permitted herself to ask in years. Was this really victory? Or was it just a different kind of prison? The answer, she suspected, depended entirely on what the next chapter of her life would bring. If you've been captivated by Camilla's journey, her transformation from a betrayed bride into the most formidable force in Naples, then you understand the power of resilience, intelligence, and the dangerous intersection between revenge and ambition. Her story isn't finished. The empire she's built, the enemies she's made, the secrets she's keeping, they're all building toward something larger, something that will test everything she's become. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to this channel now to follow Camilla's story as it continues to unfold. New chapters, new characters, new revelations, all coming soon. Hit the notification bell so you're immediately alerted when the next installment is released, because in Camilla's world, timing is everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next chapter.